The Rio Grande Valley in what is now southern Texas and northern Mexico was home to many tiny independent tribes of Native Americans known as the Coahuiltecan. The several tribes of Coahuiltecans were hunter-gatherers. Their population plummeted as a result of Old World illnesses and several small-scale conflicts with the Spanish, Apache, and other indigenous people who the Spanish first encountered in the 16th century. The Coahuiltecan people were mostly compelled to live in substandard conditions following Texas's separation from Mexico. The last known members of Coahuiltecan bands were discovered by ethnologist Albert Gatschet in 1886. 2 Pakawa, 1 Cotoname, and 25 Comecrudo. They resided in the vicinity of Reynosa, Mexico. Approximately south of a line that runs from the Gulf Coast at the mouth of the Guadalupe River to San Antonio and westward to the area surrounding Del Rio, the Coahuiltecan people lived in the flat, brushy, arid land of northern Mexico and southern Texas. Both banks of the Rio Grande were home to them. The Tonkawa lived inland to their northeast, while the Karankawa lived along the Texas coast. The Jumano were to their north. The Comanche and Lipan Apache later moved into this region. The area around Monclova, Coahuila, and Monterrey, Nuevo Leon served as their ambiguous western border. They extended southward to the Tropic of Cancer, the Sierra de Tamaulipas, and about where Ciudad Victoria, Tamaulipas is now. The majority of the Coahuiltecans lived inland despite being close to the Gulf of Mexico. There isn't much fresh water for almost 70 miles, 110 kilometers, north and south of the Rio Grande, close to the Gulf. As a result, bands had less opportunities to dwell close and use coastal resources, since they were unable to subsist there and were denied access to other resources like fish and shellfish. Coahuila, the state in New Spain where the Spanish colonists first came into contact with Coahuiltecan peoples, inspired the name Coahuiltecan. The Spanish took its name from a Nahuatl term. A group of related languages make up the Coahuiltecan languages. It is not to be confused with the Coahuiltecro language. Scholars like Jessica L. Sanchez Flores, of Nahuatl origin, are working to bring back the extinct Coahuiltecan languages. According to linguists, Coahuiltecan is a member of the Hokan language family, which includes Baja California, Arizona, and modern-day California. However, because of a lack of evidence, most modern linguists reject this idea and maintain that the Coahuiltecan were linguistically and culturally diverse. It is known that at least 7 languages were spoken, including Coahuiltecan, also known as Pakawa, which is spoken by many tribes in the vicinity of San Antonio. Comecrudo and Cotoname, which are spoken by people in the Pakawa and Rio Grande deltas, are the most well-known of the languages. Several of these languages had their vocabularies collected by Catholic missionaries in the 18th and 19th centuries, but there aren't enough linguistic samples to determine relationships between them. The Tonkawa and Karankawa may have shared linguistic ancestry with the Coahuiltecan. The names of almost 1,000 bands or ethnic groupings were documented by Spanish explorers and missionary priests over the 3 centuries of Spanish colonization. Bands were commonly identified by geographical features or locales, and their names and compositions undoubtedly change frequently. It seems that most of the bands had between 100 and 500 members. 2 academics have estimated that at the time of initial contact with the Spanish, there were between 86,000 and 100,000 non-agricultural Indians, including the Coahuiltecan, living in northeastern Mexico and adjoining Texas. The most heavily inhabited region, the Rio Grande Delta, was home to about 15,000 of them. Spanish chroniclers noted a small population of Africans in the delta in 1757 They were reportedly escaping enslavement. By the middle of the 17th century, enslavement and smallpox had wiped out the Coahuiltecan in the Monterey region. The Coahuiltecans in Texas may have been less affected by European illnesses and slave raids than the native inhabitants in northern Mexico, since they were far from the main centers of Spanish expansion. However, interaction between trade and indigenous peoples is how the diseases spread. Following the establishment of a Franciscan Roman Catholic mission at San Antonio in 1718, the native population saw a sharp decline, especially as a result of smallpox outbreaks that started in 1739. Prior to 1825, most of these groups disappeared, and those that survived were assimilated by other Mexican or Texas indigenous and mestizo communities. Coahuiltecan civilization is the culmination of more than 11,000 years of a way of life that had successfully adapted to the climate and resources of South Texas. The people were commonly identified by living in small, independent bands, not farming, and without political unity beyond the band and extended family. They were hunter-gatherers who lived on the move, carrying little possessions as they traveled in an adaptable way to obtain seasonal food supplies without exhausting them. Then built small round houses at campsites using frames of 4 bent poles and then covered them with woven mats. They wore very little because they were used to the warm weather. Bands occasionally assembled in hundreds of people, but their encampments were usually small, with only a few dozen people living in a few houses. Some Coahuiltecans led more sedentary lives along the Rio Grande, possibly building larger houses and using palm fronds as construction materials. The Coahuiltecan people hunted deer, bison, peccary, armadillos, rabbits, mice, snakes, lizards, frogs, salamanders, and snails. They fished for shellfish. Fish was probably the most important food source for those living near the Rio Grande Delta. They cooked over an open fire or fire pit, but most of their food could be eaten on raw. They primarily ate vegetation for sustenance. Pecans were a major source of protein, harvested in the fall and stored for later use. They cooked the root crowns and bulbs of the lequilia, sodal, and maguey in pits and ground mesquite beans for flour. The prickly pear, from its petals to its fruits, was a staple summertime sustenance. It also supplied water in times of scarcity. Plant roots were an important source of nutrition throughout the winter. Most Coahuiltecans seem to have traveled frequently for their meal gatherings. A 30-square-mile area was home to 10 different summer campsites for the Paya tribe near San Antonio. During the winter, some Indians lived near the ocean. The earliest Europeans known to have lived among and traveled through Coahuiltecan territories were Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca and his 3 friends in the early 1530s. They were survivors of a disastrous Spanish mission to Florida. 3 Spanish ships were sunk on Padre Island in 1554. 100 survivors attempted to go south to Spanish colonies in Mexico. The Indians slew them except for one. Luis de Carvajal y Cueva, a Spaniard, launched a raid in the Rio Grande in the early 1570s, most likely to seize slaves, but also supposedly to exempt revenge on the Indians for their attack on the stranded sailors in 1554. Carvajal, the governor of Nuevo León, and a group of renegades who acknowledged neither God nor king, began conducting regular slave raids in 1580 to capture Coahuiltecans near the Rio Grande. They were not helpless Coahuiltecans. In 1587, they forced the Spanish out of Nuevo León and frequently raided Spanish villages. However, when more Spanish settlers arrived in 1596, they lacked the political cohesion and organization needed to mount a successful resistance. Throughout the 17th century, there were continuous conflicts between the Coahuiltecan peoples and the Spanish. The Spanish forced the Indians to adopt the encomenda system instead of enslavement. This was less harmful to Indian conditions than slavery, although it was exploitative. Their inability to develop immunity meant that Indians were often affected by smallpox and measles outbreaks, causing many deaths. Other epidemics occurred every few years after the first one in the region, which was recorded in 1636 to 1639. Juan Bautista Chapa, a 17th century historian of Nuevo León, identified 161 bands that had formerly lived near Monterrey and had since disappeared, and he projected that all Indians and tribes would soon be annihilated by disease. Spanish expeditions kept discovering vast Coahuiltecan villages in the Rio Grande Delta and large multi-tribal encampments along southern Texas's rivers, particularly in the vicinity of San Antonio. In order to spread Christianity among the Coahuiltecan and other local Indians, particularly the Jumano, the Spanish founded Mission San Antonio de Valero, well known as the Alamo, in 1718. They quickly established 4 more missions. To a certain degree, the Coahuiltecan backed the missions, enlisting the Spanish to defend them against a fresh threat, northern Apache, Comanche, and Wichita raids. In its heyday, from 1720 until 1772, the 5 missions housed over 1,200 Coahuiltecan and other Indians. Frequent runaways and desertions demonstrated how unhappy the Indians were with their lives at the missions. The Coahuiltecan's remaining demographic bastion, the lower Rio Grande Valley and Delta, was first settled by the Spanish in 1748. In 1757, the Spanish discovered 14 distinct bands residing in the Delta. Within a few decades, the majority of the Coahuiltecan were assimilated by the Spanish and Mestizo people due to the overwhelming quantity of Spanish settlers. The missions close to San Antonio were secularized in 1824 after a protracted decline. Since they were assimilated into the Spanish-speaking Mestizo population, the Coahuiltecan people seem to have vanished. In 1827, the census of San Antonio only identified 4 property owners as Indians. During the 1836 Texas Revolution, a man known as a Mission Indian, most likely a Coahuiltecan, fought on the Texan side. A few families kept recollections and aspects of their Coahuiltecan ancestry in the neighborhood of Berg's Mill, which is close to the old San Juan Capistrano mission. These families banded together to publicly protest the removal of Indian remains from the old mission cemetery in the late 20th century. Archaeologists investigated the mission to prepare for efforts aimed at preserving the structures. Scholar Alston V. Thomes puts it thus way: they became readily visible as resurgent Coahuiltecans.